the crisis in the Red Sea deepens, exporters are wondering how to get their goods to market. Iran-backed Houthi militants in Yemen have stepped up attacks on vessels in the area in recent weeks, and that's to show support for Hamas during Israeli military offensive in Gaza. Now, the attacks have disrupted a key trade route, in fact, linking Europe and North America with Asia via the Suez Canal. It accounts for about 10% of global GDP as well. Major shippers, including Maersk, have opted to send their vessels around South Africa instead, a safer but much longer route. So this has exporters scrambling for alternative air, land or ocean options. So joining us to discuss further on the line is Operation Hunger Interim CEO Sandy Bukula to look at the impact of trade attacks in the Red Sea on food security. Sandy, good afternoon and thanks for your time with us on the SABC at this hour. Sandy, if you can hear me, we're just obviously going to get into conversation about the impact these strikes have had on food security, perhaps not limited to the Middle East, but the global sphere as well. Perhaps you could speak to what are some of the concerns arising given the ripple effects that we're slowly seeing emerging.
I think basically when we're looking at the agricultural trade between ourselves and in Yemen, we don't have the BMI data in full for the last quarter and the third quarter, of course, because we should be expecting to get that by the end of the first quarter next year. But what we can already slowly see is definitely we are anticipating a a decrease in terms of what we normally make annually with Yemen by 4.3%. Of course, we still don't know which categories, but what we do know already is that for like for commodities like maize, cereal base, and grains, definitely there we're looking at about less decrease of about 25%. So of course, as I indicated, that we still basically are waiting to get the exact categories in terms of the BMI, data, which we don't have at the moment. But if we're looking at Yemen and South Africa as well, in terms of just like the food security issue, we're almost similar in terms of our vulnerabilities, and because it's deeply entrenched in inequities as well as South Africa is the same. And I think if we're looking at our physical indicators in terms of malnutrition stats, our stunting is not necessarily so far apart, because as for South Africa, we are sitting now at about almost 30% and they're on 26%. So I think basically the types of determinants and the issues that, like the people in Palestine specifically, just like the actual population is experiencing, is very similar to our dynamic here, even though, and now of course it will be exacerbated by like the climate emergency. I do want to indicate as well, domestically at the moment, is that, like the inflation for 2023 has impacted us so much, because we've seen a rise in food and in food prices and the escalation at about 9.9%. And we're only just talking about the average household food basket. And I do know, for example, at the moment, even with agriculture as well, both for commercial as well as non-commercial, so informal traders as well as subsistence farming, we've seen quite a huge decrease because of the, like the latest climate change. Also, what we've seen so far as well in terms of production, we've seen at least about a 16% decrease in production, but we don't have the final figures for annual to annual year to just see how much that has impacted the GDP for the country as well. But what we know for sure, in terms of the production, we've experienced quite a lot of decreases, which impacts, of course, household food insecurity, because for homes that depend on subsistence farming, especially now during the planting season, for complementary diets, and in a way in terms of mitigating a coping strategy with the rising inflation for just basic homes in South Africa, we've seen quite a huge increase, and it's quite worrying. As I'm speaking to you, we're currently in the Eastern Cape, and we're basically distributing, water tanks. And, the province has faced quite a huge drought, together with Northern Cape as well as Limpopo. And you would know these areas produce quite a lot of our crops. And so it's basically the load shedding and the water shedding is basically going to impact us this much. Of course, the drought, because we've seen that we've only started to experience, the planting season only coming in the middle of September, which for us is usually between July and August in the country. So definitely, we are seeing, like the trends that are currently happening in Yemen, even with, like the current climate climate emergency, is really impacting us as well here. But we are quite hopeful because I see, with World Bank has put out almost like a grant sanction that is almost looking at how, we can be protected, like the countries can be protected that are trading in that area. I know the U.S. has already, sent its strategy through, but I am really hopeful that Africa also, especially South Africa, because, the Red Sea, we're seeing it brings us quite a lot of revenue when it comes to exports as well as imports.
No, absolutely. I think just for those who are not privy to the significant strategic importance of the Southern Red Sea, perhaps you could speak to that, but also the concerns about, how the U.S. is or has or is going to be responding, as well as other nations, given what is at stake, concerns about how long the attacks by Houthi is also going to last. I mean, walk us through what those dynamics are posing as we speak.
So at the moment, what we already know, I think basically the BFAP as well as the agriculture department would be able to provide us, with a clearer tactics in terms of the food systems and the food supply at the moment. But what we do know, which is basically for all trades, for maize, rice, wheat, the inflation prices have been skyrocketing. But in terms of, like with what we've seen some other commodities such as weapons, we are making kind of a bit of profit there. So until we can get the categories as we are, because you should remember with us, with South Africa as well as Yemen, we actually have got specific categories in terms of our commodities that we actually measure. So at the moment, we only just have the overall indicators, which is basically, but it's quite not as clear in terms of the categories in which, where are we actually performing well, what sort of, type of policies as well as strategies that we can already be enforcing. But I would imagine that basically the presidency and the government is already looking at those specific, as those specific opportunities, because of course we've seen the opportunities in terms of the of some of the other areas where we are currently making revenue at the moment, specifically on chemicals, food processed foods as well. I think tobacco also, it's seemingly good. But we don't necessarily have the indicators that can really show us specifically, because some areas we've dropped, but some areas we've actually increased drastically.
And then also, just as we specifically shine a spotlight on what's happening in the Middle East, I mean, East Jerusalem, the West Bank, Gaza, the lack of the ceasefire being implemented and sufficient aid also reaching those in need. I mean, on the ground, in reality, what are some of the, situations that the ordinary civilians, innocent civilians are facing as we speak? And as we see different forces, countering and siding with different allies, are there concerns about this escalating or, prolonging for much further, given what is at stake and what's left of the situation there for ordinary civilians?
I think basically, like the estimates in terms of the food security and how the conflict is impacting the ordinary citizens, and basically aid being managed, because some of it is basically being carried, as almost like a weapon, so it doesn't necessarily reach the ordinary citizens, and of course because they would want to use it, as a threat and as a way to gain, leverage on their side. So basically what we can already tell is that, of course, we can already estimate that, like your malnutrition indicators, which is basically both stunting, wasting, and low birth weight and all of that, and starvation basically is definitely a threat to your normal civilians, because, of course, if there is destabilization and that disruption as well, things like being able to move through the food system, including even with aid, is not as simple as it would be. But I know, for example, like the bigger aid agencies such as USAID and so forth, have been trying to be moving, some goods within the citizens, although with such volatility.